what we are talking about, we already kind of know that the census is a count of population that is given in the United States. How often do we take the census, class? That's right, every 10 years. And the last one was held in 2010, so the next one won't be until 2020. And my notes here say that we're still waiting for results. That's not entirely true. We already have a pretty good handle of the results from the 2010 one, and you saw some of those in the last project you did. The last population count puts us somewhere around slightly over 300 million people living in the United States. There are some people who might ask, well, why do we take a census? Well, it is a government mandated activity by the Constitution, and the federal government uses it to give information about where they should build schools, to identify areas of growth so that they can keep track of immigration and build highways and water and all sorts of services that the government provides. But also what happens is that they use the census to identify the representatives for Congress. Based off the size of your state, that determines how many representatives that you get to the United States House of Representatives. The smallest states get 1. Illinois currently gets 19. And really large states get more, such as California has 55, I believe. So we count the population to determine how many representatives we will get to Congress. And that number changes. Now, in the last 3 census, Illinois has actually lost a congressman each time, and that's not because the state's getting smaller. If you paid attention in your homework, you actually note that the population of Illinois has steadily increased, but the difference is that we have not increased by as much as some other states. So California is getting more, Illinois is losing them. That's just kind of the nature of the deal. So if our population has been rising steadily, how does that happen? Go ahead and guess some ideas. How does our population increase? Yes, immigration. Of course, that is one way. What is another way? Babies, right? You have babies born. More babies born than people dying equals more people in your population. And the third way would be something that doesn't happen very often, but that is adding a territory. So first we have the birth rate higher than death rate. What that refers to is called natural growth, I should say. Currently the United States is experiencing natural growth. We have a birth rate about 14 per 1,000, which means if you took America and you broke it down to 1,000 people, 14 of them would have been newborns that year. And our current death rate is around 8 per 1,000. So 8 out of 1,000 Americans die each year. And that birth rate is higher than the death rate. Therefore, you do see what we call natural growth, right? Now, there was a time when our birth rate was skyrocketing. This was in the 1950s. And this was a time when you just see waves of babies all coming at once in the United States. This is an illustration from the baby boom, and you see the nurses, and they have the babies in the hallway, and it's just stacked back as far as the eye could see. Well, there was a reason for that. In the 1940s, we fought some prolonged wars, World War II, and then the Korean conflict shortly followed. And so around 1950, those wars were over, and all the sailors and soldiers started coming home, and all the young people who had been drafted started coming home and returning with their girlfriends and getting married, and pretty much happened in one big swarm where all the soldiers came home from war. And so 9 months later, mystery, all these babies are born, right? And they just continued having kids. It goes from that initial wave, makes it very easy that there's daycare and there's books, and it just seems to be the trendy thing to do. So they have kids and they have more kids and so on and so forth. So people in the 1950s had really large families. As an example of that, my dad is one of 6 kids. Having 6 kids today would be pretty rare, but during the baby boom, that was kind of the expectation. Another way, I don't know what that screen is. Another way is to add a new territory. This doesn't happen very often, but if we add new states into the country, this causes the population to grow, such as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo after the Mexican-American War, added all sorts of southwestern states to our population and thus caused the country to grow. So some Mexican Americans that live in the Southwest, places like New Mexico and Utah and Arizona, things that we got from this treaty, they like to say, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And that's very true. That's the way that they joined the United States. And the last way, of course, is through immigration. Well, we know a lot about immigration. We spend a lot of time talking about that. This graph just illustrates to you the steady population growth in the United States. This estimate was made in 2007, so it'd be more like here now. But it's pretty accurate. This trend did prove to be true. And you'll note that, our population now is like what? About 320 million. And let's see, back in the 1950s, it was under 150 million people. So our population pretty much has doubled in the past 50 years, and that trend's pretty much been true for every 50 years since the 1800s. So the population's doubling at a rate of about 50 years, and maybe you see a little bit of a decline, but not a real gigantic one. We still seem to be growing. Other trends that the American population has seen, beyond just the fact that we're growing, is where the population is growing. In the 1800s to the 1920s, basically what happened was urbanization. Cities got bigger, and by urban we mean big cities, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles. They just get bigger and bigger, and they build vertically, and that was the trend in American history till the 1920s. Urban places grew. Cities are large towns. Not so much the rural areas where we live, right? The farms and the small, that was not so popular. These areas grew, not these. Well, in the 1920s, something changed. It wasn't just the urban area, but all the growth that was in the urban area explodes out into the suburbs and starts to expand in what we call the metropolitan area. Why do you think in the 1920s that would cause the metropolitan areas to grow? What device would make that possible? That's right, the car. So in 1920s, the suburbs grew. These residential communities surrounding the urban area grew, and the root cause to that really was the automobile. The car caused all that to grow. And that's pretty much been the trend in our population growth. Urban areas grew. 1920s, it exploded into this area surrounding, and that's still where most of the growth happens locally, are in these metropolitan areas. Metropolitan area refers to, like, here you got Chicago, right? But all around Chicago are these suburbs, and these suburbs are where we've seen the most growth. Actually, the population of Chicago in the last census declined, but the metropolitan area to Chicago grew. So metropolitan area means Chicago and all of its suburbs. And that's kind of easy to think about. We're not even in a suburb of Chicago, really, but we kind of treat ourselves like that. Like, if you think of it, you go on vacation and people ask where you're from, and you're like, Chicago, because you don't want to explain to them you're from some small city 60 miles from Chicago. You just use Chicago in reference to this metropolitan area, and everybody understands. Okay, so what we're referring to is the migration of people, the movement of Americans within America, and pretty much what we've seen is people are moving to the burbs. They're moving to the suburbs. Another region that sees migration is the American Southwest, also referred to as the Sun Belt. So Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, California, these are the places that have seen the most growth, so to speak, in the last couple years. So Southwest. And why might you expect that? Why is there growth in the Sun Belt? What's very close here? Right, Mexico. So you have a lot of immigration in these regions, but you also have a lot of like old people who retire from Illinois and are moving to the Southwest because the land is cheap. They also have larger families, particularly Hispanic families have had larger families, and that causes growth in that region. So that's where we have seen the most growth. And we also, if you remember from your homework, Florida was also growing pretty quickly. Other things that the census tells us, Latin Americans are one of the fastest growing groups of people. At one point, Kendall County was the fastest growing county in the country, second fastest, behind Las Vegas. And this is kind of staggering. They estimate by 2030, Texas, California, and Florida are going to be 40% of the United States population. 3 states will be 4 out of 10 Americans. 3 out of 47, 4 out of 10 Americans live there. So that's pretty crazy, and they think that's probably going to happen. About 11.7% of Americans are foreign born. Most of those people come from Latin America. That is a region that includes Mexico and Central America and South America combined. And then the second rate is Asia, then Europe. Education is been on the rise. 84% of Americans today graduate with a high school diploma, and that is the highest it has been. And we have a higher rate, about 27% have bachelor's degrees. And if we look at the average earnings of people based on their educational status, it does seem to pay to stay in school. You know, just to graduate high school, you essentially increase your earnings, lifetime earnings, by about 50% per year, which is pretty significant. Now, obviously, are there exceptions to that? Are there, high school dropouts that became millionaires? Yeah, there's a few, but if you play the averages, it's worth, about half your lifetime earning to graduate high school. Or to put that another way, it's about $10,000 a year. If you expect to live to 70, which I think most of you would, you're talking about $600,000 across your lifetime just to graduate high school. So I would say that's worth it. And then between high school and a bachelor's degree, a 4-year degree in college, it almost doubles from high school. And then if you get an advanced degree on top of that, it's another 50% increase. So what we see in education is more and more Americans getting educated, and this tends to correlate with what they get paid. Now, it should be said, since the recession of 2008, things have changed a little bit. The earnings of some bachelor degree recipients is not nearly as high because they're not getting employed. So that has lowered the average a little bit. And they're also concerned about, the debt from college loans and that nature. But really, the standard has been education pays. Even if it doesn't pay as well as it might have used to, it's still pretty beneficial. Family sizes are also being changed. In 2007, the average age of getting married the first time was 25.8 for women, 27.4 for men. And that is almost exactly 6 years older than it was in the 1970s. In the 70s, people were getting married 20, 21. Now people are waiting until 26, 27 to get married. Also, the size of households is declining. Since 1970, in 1970, 21% of households had 5 or more people. Today, that's only 10. So family sizes are shrinking. And also, households of 2 or more people still is a trend. Still, most Americans live with somebody else, even if we're not necessarily living in big families. Okay, so that is that. Let's review real quick to my viewing audience. What is the census? Explain. Right, it's the count of population, and we take it how often? Right, every decade, 10 years. What's going on to the number of people going to college, up or down? It is that's a tricky question. It pretty much is in the increase, although recently, like real recently, it's declined a little bit. But from the 1970s, it's definitely up. Okay, Urban and rural. Which area do you live in? Yes, a rural area. Okay, we're not referencing big cities like Chicago. That's urban. Okay, we're not even referring to places like Joliet or Romeoville. Those places, that is metropolitan area Chicago, and those are called suburbs. So they're not urban or rural, but those are the two differences. What other regions have been growing besides the suburbs? The Sun Belt, the American Southwest, Florida. How often is the census taken? We already answered that, 10 years. The last one was 2010. And 3 ways the population can grow. We got immigration, growing a new territory, such as the Trudy, Guadalupe, Hidalgo, and natural growth. So, that is the notes for this unit. I hope you found that helpful, and you should have an outline to fill out that goes with that. So feel free to stop the video, rewind the video, do what you need with that. But okay, thank you.